Welcome, dear friends, and thank you for joining me this evening. Outside, the snow falls softly over our little English village, laying a gentle hush upon the rooftops and hedgerows. Inside, a fire crackles cheerfully, the kettle sings, and the faint sound of carols drifts from the church across the green. It is the perfect night to gather close, pour a cup of tea, and share a tale. Tonight's story is the Christmas Eve Murder Whispers, a Miss Marple Mystery. Tell me, dear friends, do you believe Christmas brings out only joy, or sometimes hidden secrets too? On Christmas Eve, the village of Willowbrook gathered in St. Luke's Church, its stone walls aglow with candlelight. Outside, snowflakes drifted in slow silence, but within, voices rose together in the familiar comfort of carols. The scent of evergreen garlands and beeswax candles filled the air, and for a moment all seemed peaceful, timeless, safe. But just as the congregation reached the verse of hark, the herald angels sing, a sudden commotion broke the harmony. A man at the back pew gave a sharp gasp, clutched at his throat, and collapsed onto the flagstone floor. His hymn book fell with a heavy echo, pages crumpling beneath booted feet. Gasps turned into whispers, whispers of poison, of grudges, of scandal. The vicar called for calm. The constable rushed forward, but amid the confusion, one elderly lady remained still. Miss Jane Marple, her gloved hands folded neatly on her lap, observed quietly. She noted the missing glove left on the pew, the faint trace of bitter almond in the air, the startled glance exchanged between two villagers near the aisle. And so, dear friends, I ask you, had you been there in the flicker of candlelight, what would you have noticed first? Chapter 1. Whispers Beneath the Holly Wreaths. The morning after the dreadful scene at St. Luke's, the village of Willowbrook was already humming with speculation. In kitchens where kettles steamed and parlors where fires burned brightly, the talk was of nothing but the man who had fallen so suddenly at the carol service. At the post office, Mrs. Penberry leaned heavily over the counter, whispering to anyone who would listen that she had seen the victim's lips turn a peculiar shade before he collapsed. A sure sign of poison, she insisted, though she had never seen poison at work in her life. Meanwhile, at the grocer's, Mr. Bittlesworth declared it must have been nothing more than heart failure, pointing out that such things happened to men of his age. His wife, however, sniffed and murmured darkly about unpaid debts and quarrels. In the warmth of her own sitting room, Miss Marple sat quietly, needles clicking gently as she knitted a soft blue scarf. Visitors dropped in under the pretense of bringing her holly or biscuits, but mostly to share the latest whispers. She listened with her usual air of kindly distraction, nodding at tales of suspicious looks and unexplained absences. Yet behind her serene expression, Miss Marple was carefully storing away the odd details, the widow's hurried denial, the maid's nervous, fluttering hands, the curious insistence of certain villagers on blaming the obvious. Human nature, she reflected, was very much the same in Willowbrook as it was in St. Mary Mead. And as the clock ticked steadily on her mantelpiece, Miss Marple thought, beneath all the holly and tinsel, there were secrets here that would not remain hidden for long. The snow continued to fall softly over Willowbrook, muffling footsteps and cloaking the cottages in quiet beauty. But beneath that peaceful blanket, suspicion was stirring like a restless wind. Neighbors, meeting in the lane or at the butcher's counter, lowered their voices and spoke in tones more hushed than the carols still echoing from a church. There was talk of debts. The late Mr. Hargrave, it seemed, had been less prompt in settling his accounts than his gentlemanly manner suggested. More than one villager recalled hearing sharp words exchanged with the local solicitor only weeks before. Others hinted at private quarrels of a more delicate nature. Mrs. Penberry, with a meaningful glance, suggested that the widow's tears at the church had been a little too ready, her sobs a touch rehearsed. And then there was the matter of the maid. Poor Clara, pale and nervous, had been seen slipping out of the Hargrave house the previous evening, her eyes red, her hands trembling. What had she to hide? Some said a broken heart, others something darker still. Even the vicar did not escape whispered speculation. Had he not seemed unusually flustered when he hurried to the fallen man's side? Had he known more than he was saying? Everywhere, glances were exchanged over teacups and through frosted window panes. Sharp, questioning, heavy with doubt. And through it all, Miss Marple walked quietly, her eyes bright, taking in far more than anyone realized. Miss Marple had always believed that human nature was much the same wherever one went, whether in a grand city or a quiet village lane. And so, as she sat by her fire with her knitting needles flashing gently in and out of soft blue wool, the talk of Willowbrook did not surprise her. It reminded her very much of other occasions, in other villages, where tragedy had struck and tongues had wagged. There was, for instance, the case of old Mr. Ellison, a gardener in St. Mary Mead, who had once just happened to faint after tea in his own potting shed. The village at once declared it was his weak constitution, but Miss Marple, even then, had noted how carefully his neighbor's wife had pressed him to drink that final cup. In the end, it had been the smallest clue, a misplaced teacup on the wrong shelf, that revealed the truth of jealousy and bitterness lying beneath the surface. So was now. The hurried denial of the widow, the trembling hands of the maid, the oddly vehement protestations of the grocer's wife. These were not merely idle curiosities, but signs of something deeper. Human beings, Miss Marple reflected, were often quite transparent if one had the patience to observe. They revealed themselves in their denials, in their eagerness to blame others, in their too-ready explanations. And here, in Willowbrook, with its pretty holly wreaths and glistening snow, the same old passions, greed, envy, betrayal, might be hidden under layers of carols and Christmas cheer. Quietly, she laid down her knitting, her eyes thoughtful. Somewhere in this web of whispers lay the truth, waiting to be untangled. That night, the village lay hushed beneath its cloak of snow. Smoke curled faintly from chimneys, windows glowed softly with lamplight, and all seemed still. Yet down on the lane where the late Mr. Hargrave's cottage stood empty, shadows moved where none ought to be. The moonlight caught the outline of a figure lingering by the gate, cautious, hesitant, glancing this way and that as though fearful of being observed. For several moments the figure remained motionless, as if listening. Then, with deliberate care, the latch was lifted and the gate creaked softly open. A single knock echoed against the cottage door. Not the confident rap of a caller, but a testing sound, uncertain, furtive. Receiving no answer, the figure pressed closer, fumbling at the lock. Inside, the rooms lay dark and silent. It was clear the intruder was determined to gain entry. From a window across the lane, a curtain stirred ever so slightly. Someone had seen, or thought they had. But by the time the church clock struck 11, the shadow had melted into the night, leaving behind only a trail of prints in the snow and the uneasy knowledge that secrets were being sought. Chapter 2. The Silver Teapot Clue. The morning after Christmas Eve dawned pale and frosty, the village green glittering beneath a thin crust of ice. Miss Marple, wrapped in her sensible woolen coat and sturdy boots, made her way to the vicarage. It was her habit, after a disturbance of any kind, to call upon the vicar's wife, ostensibly to lend a hand, but in truth because few things stirred up useful information quite like tea poured among parish matters. Mrs. Greenaway, the vicar's wife, received her warmly, ushering her into the sitting room where a small fire sputtered in the grate. On the low table, set neatly with china cups, stood a gleaming silver teapot. It caught Miss Marple's eye at once, for it was not the vicarage's usual pot. She knew that well enough from countless afternoons of tea. This one was larger, heavier, and polished to a mirror sheen, as though someone had taken quite unusual care with it. Mrs. Greenaway, flustered and talkative, poured tea and spoke of the dreadful events at the church, wringing her hands over the gossip swirling through the village. Miss Marple listened gently, nodding in the right places, but her eyes returned again and again to that teapot. Why was it here? Why today of all days? And why did Mrs. Greenaway, usually so brisk, avoid explaining its sudden appearance? Miss Marple, though smiling kindly, tucked the observation away. Small oddities often prove the most telling in the end. It was just as Miss Marple was taking her second cup of tea that young Constable Briggs arrived at the vicarage, stamping snow from his boots and wearing an expression of immense self-importance. He was a good-natured lad, earnest in his duties, but inclined, as many young men are, to overestimate his own cleverness. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, tugging off his gloves. "You'll be glad to hear we've made real progress already. Not to say the case is solved, but it won't be long now." Mrs. Greenaway fussed about with biscuits while he leaned closer, lowering his voice. "It was poison, no doubt about that. The doctor found traces straight away. We've even got the wine cup, print clear as daylight. Shouldn't be difficult to match them." He looked quite triumphant, as though the whole affair were now tidily wrapped up. Miss Marple, her needles working steadily at the scarf she had brought with her, looked up mildly. "Fingerprints, you say? How very clever. Though I suppose one might expect to find a good many, given how cups at such gatherings tend to be passed about. Don't you think?" The constable blinked. "Well, yes, of course, but these prints are distinct. Strong evidence, I'd say." She smiled benignly. "Indeed. Though I do wonder, was the cup in the victim's hand when he fell? Or might it have been placed there afterwards? People are sometimes so careless in a moment of excitement." Constable Briggs shifted uncomfortably, his certainty wavering. He muttered something about laboratory tests and hurried off, leaving Miss Marple with her knitting and a thoughtful expression. She knew better than most that too much confidence in early clues often led one entirely astray. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself in the small lane beside the church, her knitting bag tucked neatly under one arm. She had a way of walking at a pace that seemed leisurely, yet brought her precisely where she might encounter those who had something to say. And so it was she met Molly, the young maid employed at the Hargrave household. Molly's cheeks were pink from the cold, and she bobbed a quick curtsy when she saw Miss Marple. "Terrible business, ma'am," she whispered, glancing nervously at the looming tower of St. Luke's. "I can't hardly sleep for thinking of it." Miss Marple, her voice gentle, encouraged her to walk along a little way. "These things do weigh on one's mind, my dear, but sometimes it helps to talk." The words tumbled out. Molly confessed that, just before the carol service, she had lingered by the church porch. She had heard raised voices, Mr. Hargrave arguing with someone, though she could not see who. A man's voice, sharp and angry. "It must end tonight, or you'll regret it." She was too frightened to linger, but the words had lodged in her memory like a burr in wool. Miss Marple listened with grave attention, nodding softly, never pressing too hard. "Thank you, my dear. Sometimes little things, easily overlooked, prove the most useful of all." Molly looked relieved, as though unburdened of a secret, and hurried on her way. Left alone beneath the churchyard yews, Miss Marple gazed thoughtfully at the snow-dusted gravestones. Whispers before the service, a silver teapot, and an overconfident constable. Little threads, perhaps, but when woven together, they might yet reveal the pattern hidden beneath. That evening, when most of the villagers had gone home to their suppers, Miss Marple lingered in the quiet of St. Luke's. The church smelt faintly of candle wax and pine from the wreaths that still hung about the pews. She moved slowly down the aisle, her gloved hand brushing the polished wood, eyes noticing small details others never thought to see. At one of the side pews, a hymn book lay askew. Miss Marple picked it up, intending to place it neatly with the others. But as she opened it, a small slip of paper crackled free and fluttered to the floor. Stooping, she retrieved it. The paper was creased and hastily folded, its edges damp from the church's chill. In neat but hurried handwriting were 5 words that made her pause. "It must be tonight, after the service." Miss Marple read it twice, her brow furrowing. There was no name, no signature, no addressee, just a promise or a threat, cloaked in secrecy. She slipped the note carefully into her knitting bag, her expression calm. Yet behind her clear blue eyes was the keen awareness that someone in the village had planned something long before the fatal hymn had begun. Chapter 3. The Wrong Man in Custody. By the following morning, the air in Willowbrook carried a new sharpness, not from the winter frost, but from the buzz of news carried on every lip. Constable Briggs, looking puffed with self-importance, made his announcement at the post office. The police had arrested young Edward Hargrave, nephew of the deceased. He had both motive and temper, Briggs declared, chin lifted. Everyone knows there were quarrels over the inheritance. The uncle was set to alter his will. That's proof enough of bad blood. Villagers nodded gravely, the weight of scandal balanced by the comfort of resolution. At the bakery, Mrs. Potter murmured that justice would be done at last. At the draper's, Miss Finch sighed with relief. So unpleasant, after all, to think of poison lingering unsolved in a quiet parish. Even the vicar's wife, pouring tea for callers, declared it a sad affair, but perhaps best concluded swiftly. Only Miss Marple, seated by the fire with her knitting, remained silent. She remembered Edward Hargrave as a restless, impulsive young man, fond of motor cars and late-night parties, but not, she thought, a creature of patience and cunning. Poison was rarely the weapon of the hot-tempered. It required subtlety, calculation, qualities Edward sorely lacked. As the village settled back into a semblance of calm, Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. She had seen such relief before, the collective sigh when a convenient suspect was found. Yet she knew, with a certainty born of long observation, that the most obvious culprit was very rarely the true one. And so, while others allowed themselves comfort, Miss Marple allowed herself only caution. That evening, the vicarage fire burned low, casting golden shadows across the study. Miss Marple sat with her knitting while the vicar and his wife, Mrs. Greenaway, discussed the day's developments in hushed tones. "It seems straightforward enough," the vicar said, polishing his spectacles. "Edward quarreled with his uncle. The quarrel was overheard, and now the poor man lies dead. The police are not wrong to act." Mrs. Greenaway nodded, though less firmly. "And yet, I did hear he was seen at the railway station just before the service. If so, how could he have managed the poisoning?" Miss Marple looked up mildly, her needles pausing mid-click. "That is a very good question, my dear. If he were at the station, he could not have slipped into the vestry unnoticed. And poison, after all, must be administered very precisely." The vicar frowned. "But his quarrel, surely that suggests guilt?" "Not always," Miss Marple replied gently. "Young men do quarrel with older relations, especially when money is involved. But the manner of death tells us more than tempers ever do. Poison is chosen by those who prefer secrecy, those who wait for just the right moment. She resumed her knitting, eyes twinkling. Edward, poor boy, is many things, impatient, careless, foolish. But careful? No, not in the least. The vicar and his wife exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that what had seemed so tidy might, under Miss Marple's calm scrutiny, be far from settled. The snow had eased by morning, leaving the lanes between cottages crisp and glittering in the pale winter sun. Miss Marple, wrapped warmly in her gray shawl, took her usual slow walk to the grocer's. Few things passed unseen along these paths, for in villages such as Rose Hill, errands were as much about listening as they were about buying butter or tea. As she turned a corner near the yew hedge, voices drifted to her ears, hushed, hurried, not meant for company. Two figures stood half concealed by the wall, Mrs. Bartlett, the innkeeper's wife, and young Thomas, the stable boy. Both looked about nervously, their breath misting in the cold air. "I tell you, if the police keep looking, they'll find the truth," Thomas muttered, his voice urgent. Mrs. Bartlett clutched her shawl tighter. "Hush! You don't know who might be listening. Best keep quiet, for everyone's sake." "But it wasn't Edward," the boy pressed. "And if it comes out—" "Enough!" she snapped, then lowered her tone. "Best leave things as they are. Some truths are safer buried." The pair fell silent as footsteps crunched on the frosted path. Miss Marple, having paused delicately to adjust her mitten, continued past as though she had heard nothing at all. She offered them a kindly smile, the sort one gives to flustered villagers, and went on her way. But her eyes, bright and thoughtful beneath the brim of her hat, revealed that she had heard every word. The threads of the mystery were tightening, and in her mind a pattern was beginning to form. That night, the village lay hushed under its blanket of snow, lamplight glowing faintly through curtained windows. Miss Marple, invited by Mrs. Weatherby, the recently bereaved widow, stopped by for a short visit of condolence. The cottage was close and warm, scented with coal smoke and lavender polish. The widow spoke softly, almost absently, her eyes red from tears, though her manner, Miss Marple noted, was curiously brisk for fresh grief. As the kettle whistled, Miss Marple's gaze fell to the hearth. There, on the small grate, a letter was burning, its edges curling, ink vanishing into flame. Mrs. Weatherby, catching the glance, hastily prodded the paper deeper into the coals. "Oh, old bills," she said with forced lightness. "Nothing worth keeping." Yet scarcely a moment later, when she thought herself unobserved, the widow slipped another envelope, sealed, addressed, and very deliberately tucked into the pocket of her black dress. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, her face mild as milk. But inwardly she thought, bills are not sealed in such fashion. That letter, whatever its contents, was meant to survive when the other was not. And in the widow's careful concealment lay a secret that might change everything. Chapter 4. Secrets Under the Mistletoe. The village hall glowed with holly garlands and lanterns, its wooden beams strung with sprigs of mistletoe. Laughter mingled with the strains of the gramophone, and the scent of mince pies and mulled wine filled the air. Snow-dusted boots lined the entrance, and the villagers, still shaken by recent events, seemed determined to carry on with tradition. Miss Marple, seated comfortably near the stove with her knitting bag, observed the dance with her usual quiet interest. She noted how merriment could so easily conceal unease, how smiles sometimes tightened too quickly, and how hands lingered or withdrew in ways more telling than words. Couples moved about the floor, but all was not harmony. Young Margaret Lacey and her fiancé, Peter, scarcely spoke. When he offered his hand, she declined with a strained smile. At the far side, Mrs. Bartlett laughed too loudly at a remark from the doctor, though her eyes strayed nervously to the door more than once. Even the vicar's wife seemed preoccupied, glancing from one corner of the room to another as though counting who was present. And there, amid the gaiety, Miss Marple saw absence as clearly as presence. One particular villager, whose alibi had seemed too conveniently timed, had not appeared at all. She tapped her needles together softly, the rhythm as steady as her thoughts. Beneath the glow of candles and the sheen of holly wreaths, secrets whispered more loudly than carols. And Miss Marple, for all her gentle air, missed nothing. The air in the cloakroom was cooler than the hall, carrying the faint scent of damp wool and lavender sachets tucked into coat pockets. Miss Marple, retrieving her shawl for a moment of respite, found herself not quite alone. Two young maids stood by the racks, whispering urgently, their cheeks flushed with more than the warmth of the dance. "I shouldn't say it, but I saw it with my own eyes," one whispered, clutching her apron. "The master, God rest him, was quarreling in the lane, late at night." His voice was sharp as thunder. "Quarreling? With whom?" The other pressed. The maid glanced around nervously before answering. "A stranger at first, I thought, but then I heard the words. He spoke of blackmail, said he wouldn't pay another penny. And the other man, whoever he was, said he'd see to it everyone knew if he didn't." The second girl gasped, covering her mouth. At that moment, realizing they were no longer alone, both curtsied hurriedly to Miss Marple and slipped away, whispering still as they vanished down the corridor. Miss Marple drew her shawl about her shoulders, her expression mild. But inwardly, her thoughts quickened. Blackmail was a dangerous game, and more often than not, it ended in silence, the kind of silence that hung over Rose Hill even now. She returned to the hall, her eyes sharper than before, knowing the dance had just revealed a darker step in the mystery. Later that evening, when the music had softened and the villagers busied themselves with cups of mulled wine, Miss Marple settled into a quiet corner with her knitting. Her needles clicked gently, but her mind was far from wool and yarn. She was arranging, as she often did, the scraps of information gathered like puzzle pieces in her head. First, there was the matter of money. The late Mr. Weatherby had been a man of some means, but whispers spoke of dwindling accounts and unpaid debts. A quarrel over inheritance with his nephew might be reason enough for suspicion, but not, Miss Marple thought, the whole of it. Then there were the subtler threads. Margaret Lacey's strained refusal to take her fiancé's hand, Mrs. Bartlett's restless eyes at the dance, and the vicar's wife, so distracted she scarcely heard the music. Romantic entanglements, Miss Marple knew, often left sharper wounds than financial ones. And always, in her knitting bag, lay the crumpled note she had discovered in the hymn book. It must be tonight, after the service. Unsigned, undated, yet heavy with implication. Miss Marple pursed her lips. When one laid these matters side by side, money troubles, whispers of blackmail, and an unsigned warning, a pattern began to shimmer faintly through the threads. She adjusted her spectacles, her eyes drifting across the hall. The villagers laughed, danced, and drank their spiced wine, eager to forget the shadow of death. But Miss Marple, serene as ever, was quietly certain someone in this very room held the missing piece. And soon, the picture would be made clear. The village woke to an icy dawn, the snow crisp underfoot and glinting in the pale light. Yet the beauty of the morning was shattered almost immediately. Near the edge of the green, Constable Briggs and a handful of villagers had gathered, their breaths misting in the cold air, faces pale with shock. There, half buried in snow, lay the body of Mr. Thomas, the stable boy who had spoken so nervously the day before. His coat was twisted about him, frost clinging to the sleeves, and in his gloved hand he clutched a scrap of fabric, unmistakably from the late Mr. Weatherby's own coat. A hush fell over the crowd, broken only by Briggs' hurried orders to fetch the doctor. Murmurs rippled like wind through the assembled villagers. Poison, accident, or some darker design. Miss Marple, arriving quietly on the scene, bent slightly to inspect the hand, the scrap of coat, and the angle of the body. Her expression was calm, almost gentle, but the flicker in her eyes betrayed her mind racing. 2 deaths now, linked by a single, tangible clue. The village's calm had been shattered completely, and the threads of suspicion twisted ever tighter. Somewhere amid Willowbrook's snow-dusted cottages, the truth waited, and Miss Marple was determined it would not remain hidden for long. Chapter 5. The Candlelight Twist. By mid-morning, Willowbrook was alive with an undercurrent of dread. Snow-crusted streets, once so serene, were now crowded with murmuring neighbors and anxious glances. The news of Thomas's death spread faster than the winter wind, carried on breathless footsteps and whispered conjecture. In the churchyard, villagers huddled together, clutching shawls and coats, exchanging theories with wide-eyed urgency. "It's connected," one whispered, nodding toward the late Mr. Weatherby's coat scrap. "Someone's picking off witnesses, mark my words." Another muttered darkly about debts unpaid, old grudges, and the dangers of secrets long kept. The vicar moved among them, hands pressed together, offering comforting words that rang hollow to those already steeped in fear. Mrs. Greenaway, pale and trembling, wrung her hands as she listened to every version of the tale, each one more alarming than the last. Miss Marple arrived quietly, noting the expressions on familiar faces, fear mingled with curiosity, sorrow layered with suspicion. The villagers' panic, she realized, had a rhythm all its own. It magnified small discrepancies and made the ordinary seem sinister. Even a misplaced scarf or a gloved hand held too tightly became a sign of guilt in such an atmosphere. And through it all, she listened. Beneath the panic, beneath the whispers and conjecture, lay patterns waiting to be recognized. Miss Marple's sharp eyes and quiet mind began to trace the outline of a truth the village was too frightened to see. That evening, Miss Marple returned to the Weatherby cottage under the glow of lanterns strung along the lane. The snow had softened, leaving a silver sheen that reflected the flickering light. Inside, the hearth glowed, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Yet the room felt oddly unsettled, as if the very air were aware of recent horrors. She moved quietly, her eyes scanning the familiar surroundings with a practiced attention. Teacups sat half-empty on the table. A scattering of holly leaves lay on the rug, and in the corner, a small candle guttered, its wax forming a thick pool on the polished floorboards. Miss Marple bent slightly, adjusting her spectacles. The wax was unusual, a drop here, a smear there, far from any candle that had been deliberately placed. Someone had held a candle in an unconventional way, a subtle but telling detail. Small disturbances like this often revealed the movements of those who wished to remain unnoticed. She lifted a fragment of hardened wax with her knitting needle, turning it over thoughtfully. It was fresh, recently melted, yet out of place, a tiny clue that had escaped the attention of all others. Her mind began to connect threads. The wax, the timing of Thomas's death, the scrap of the elder Mr. Weatherby's coat. Each seemed inconsequential in isolation, yet together they suggested careful planning. Someone in Willowbrook had orchestrated more than one tragedy, leaving signs meant only for eyes sharp enough to notice. Miss Marple replaced the wax gently, her expression serene. Quietly, she knew she was inching closer to the hidden truth. By the following morning, Willowbrook was abuzz with speculation of a serial madman at large. Constable Briggs, emboldened by his early successes and the villagers' growing fear, spoke confidently at the post office. "It must be some unhinged fellow, acting on impulse," he declared. "Two deaths, so close together. There's no other explanation." The villagers murmured agreement, though some glanced nervously at one another, unsure if the explanation soothed or alarmed them further. Stories of mysterious strangers in other villages were recalled with wide eyes, adding weight to the young constable's theory. Miss Marple, walking home along the snow-lined lane, allowed herself a small, thoughtful smile. Two deaths, indeed, but she knew better than most that madness rarely strikes with such precision. Every action, every item left behind, spoke of careful intent rather than chaos. The wax in the Weatherby cottage, the note in the hymn book, the scrap of coat in Thomas's hand, all indicated deliberate planning, patience, and subtlety. She paused, brushing a stray snowflake from her coat, and reflected on human nature. Fear often blinds the hurried, convincing them to see chaos where order lies, to attribute impulsive motives to calculated deeds. The constable's confidence, though well-meaning, risked sending the investigation astray. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled beneath the brim of her hat as she resolved quietly to watch and wait. While panic gripped the village and the police chased shadows, she would follow the faintest, most telling traces, the ones invisible to the fearful and the impatient. In the quiet of her mind, the pattern was already emerging. The afternoon sun glinted weakly through the frost-laden branches, casting long shadows across the vicarage gate. Miss Marple walked slowly along the snow-dusted path, her eyes sweeping the ground with quiet precision. She had a feeling, subtle and persistent, that a clue might lie where others would scarcely think to look. There, half hidden beneath a drift of fresh snow, she spotted it, a single black glove, delicate yet worn, lying as if dropped in haste. She bent to retrieve it, brushing away the frost with gloved fingers of her own. The glove was small, too small for a man's hand, and bore a faint smudge of soot, perhaps from a candle or hearth fire. Her lips curved in a faint smile, her knitting bag clutched closer. The glove's location, so near the vicarage gate yet carefully concealed, suggested someone had been careful or desperate. Whoever had lost it had not intended it to be found. Yet here it was, whispering of unseen movements in the dark. Miss Marple stood silently, the glove in her palm, thinking of the events that had already unfolded. Two deaths, a crumpled note, wax out of place, and now this. Each piece of evidence was small, almost insignificant, yet together they formed a trail that might lead straight to the heart of the mystery. Chapter 6. A Trap of Tinsel and Shadows. The snow had softened to a gentle flurry, dusting rooftops and hedges with fresh white. Miss Marple, sitting by her hearth with her knitting, contemplated the threads she had gathered. The crumpled note, the wax out of place, the glove, and the whispered threats. Each was a small piece of the puzzle, but the picture remained incomplete. Quietly, she drafted a plan. With her gentle persuasion, she spoke to the vicar the next morning. Perhaps a small gathering here at the vicarage, she suggested, for tea and conversation. Nothing formal, merely a chance to see old friends and exchange a little cheer. The vicar, aware of her uncanny understanding of village ways, agreed at once. Invitations were quietly extended, word of the tea spreading like a soft ripple through Willowbrook. Villagers arrived, their boots crunching over the snow, faces bright with curiosity but tinged with unease. Each wondered why Miss Marple had chosen the vicarage rather than more public spaces, why the gathering felt private yet oddly important. Miss Marple greeted each guest warmly, her eyes twinkling beneath the brim of her hat. To outward appearances, it was a cozy, festive gathering. Yet beneath the veneer of polite conversation and steaming cups of tea, subtle examinations were taking place. Every glance, every gesture, every hesitation would be noted. For Miss Marple knew, in the gentle light of the vicarage, over modest cakes and clinking china, the truth often revealed itself to those patient enough to observe quietly. The vicarage sitting room buzzed softly with polite chatter as villagers murmured over steaming cups of tea and delicate slices of cake. Miss Marple moved among them quietly, her needles clicking gently, eyes bright beneath the brim of her hat. Every gesture, every glance, every hesitated word was filed away in her mind. She guided conversations with the lightest of touches. A comment about the Christmas dance elicited a flustered glance from Mrs. Bartlett. A question about errands in the village brought a vague, inconsistent reply from the widow. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, almost accidental, as though merely remarking on ordinary matters. "I suppose everyone has noticed the snow has made walking difficult this week? It must be tricky for those carrying parcels late in the evening." Several villagers laughed softly, but one or two betrayed a twitch of unease. Miss Marple allowed the conversation to drift, then returned, bringing up names, incidents, and places with casual curiosity. Each response, no matter how trivial, was noted. Too quick a denial, averted eyes, a pause longer than polite conversation warranted. She did not press. She simply observed. A misstep, a contradiction, a revealing sigh. These were the threads she needed to follow. By the time the villagers had finished their tea, she had set a subtle trap, one that relied not on force or accusation, but on human nature itself. By evening, as the last cup was drained and the final crumbs removed, Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire. The pattern was emerging. Someone among these familiar faces had slipped, however slightly, and soon the truth would begin to unravel under the patient scrutiny of her mind. The vicarage room hummed with the soft clatter of teacups and low conversation, the glow of the fire casting gentle shadows along the walls. Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting idle in her lap, eyes alert and observant. She had a particular phrase in mind, one that, she suspected, might elicit a reaction if carefully introduced. As she sipped her tea, she commented aloud, "It is curious how, even in small villages, one sometimes finds that secrets, long thought safe, can reveal themselves on the quietest of evenings." At this, a slight flinch came from Mr. Hawthorne, a portly man with a ruddy complexion and a habit of clearing his throat unnecessarily. He shifted in his chair, brushing a hand over the back of it almost absent-mindedly, yet Miss Marple noticed the movement immediately. The gesture was instinctive, a small, telling slip that betrayed a sudden discomfort, a flinch from recognition. She continued gently, speaking of wax dripped in the wrong place, of letters crumpled and lost, of the dangers of hidden truths. All the while, Mr. Hawthorne's eyes darted just slightly to the floor, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of a napkin. Nothing overt, nothing accusatory, yet his body spoke a language Miss Marple understood perfectly. Other villagers remained at ease, chatting and laughing politely, unaware of the subtle tension. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled beneath her spectacles. The pattern was emerging clearly. Instinctive gestures, unguarded reactions, and unconscious movements often revealed more than words ever could. By the time tea was over, she was confident that the first threads of true culpability were beginning to show themselves, quietly, unmistakably, under the calm guise of a festive gathering. The vicarage had emptied, leaving only the soft flicker of firelight and the lingering scent of tea and Christmas cake. Outside, snow drifted silently against the windows, muffling the world beyond. Miss Marple remained by the hearth, knitting needles poised, her eyes bright with calm certainty. The evening's subtle examinations, the careful steering of conversation, and the small gestures she had observed all came together in her mind. The pattern was complete, a tapestry woven of wax stains, whispered threats, and instinctive flinches. She knew now, with the quiet authority that came from decades of observation, who had orchestrated the deaths and why. The police, confident in their theories of mad impulse or convenient suspects, would not see it. Constable Briggs, bless his heart, was already drafting reports, convinced of his insight. Yet Miss Marple, serene as ever, understood the truth with unerring clarity. She leaned back, knitting resting in her lap, and allowed herself a faint smile. The killer's careful mask, the outward calm, the polite conversation, all of it had betrayed them. Outside, the village slept, oblivious to the revelation quietly achieved in a warm corner of the vicarage. Miss Marple's sharp mind held the answer, while the world waited unknowingly on the cusp of revelation. Chapter 6. A Trap of Tinsel and Shadows. The snow had softened to a gentle flurry, dusting rooftops and hedges with fresh white. Miss Marple, sitting by her hearth with her knitting, contemplated the threads she had gathered. The crumpled note, the wax out of place, the glove, and the whispered threats. Each was a small piece of the puzzle, but the picture remained incomplete. Quietly, she drafted a plan. With her gentle persuasion, she spoke to the vicar the next morning. Perhaps a small gathering here at the vicarage, she suggested, for tea and conversation. Nothing formal, merely a chance to see old friends and exchange a little cheer. The vicar, aware of her uncanny understanding of village ways, agreed at once. Invitations were quietly extended, word of the tea spreading like a soft ripple through Willowbrook. Villagers arrived, their boots crunching over the snow, faces bright with curiosity but tinged with unease. Each wondered why Miss Marple had chosen the vicarage rather than more public spaces, why the gathering felt private yet oddly important. Miss Marple greeted each guest warmly, her eyes twinkling beneath the brim of her hat. To outward appearances, it was a cozy, festive gathering. Yet beneath the veneer of polite conversation and steaming cups of tea, subtle examinations were taking place. Every glance, every gesture, every hesitation would be noted. For Miss Marple knew, in the gentle light of the vicarage, over modest cakes and clinking china, the truth often revealed itself to those patient enough to observe quietly. The vicarage sitting room buzzed softly with polite chatter as villagers murmured over steaming cups of tea and delicate slices of cake. Miss Marple moved among them quietly, her needles clicking gently, eyes bright beneath the brim of her hat. Every gesture, every glance, every hesitated word was filed away in her mind. She guided conversations with the lightest of touches. A comment about the Christmas dance elicited a flustered glance from Mrs. Bartlett. A question about errands in the village brought a vague, inconsistent reply from the widow. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, almost accidental, as though merely remarking on ordinary matters. I suppose everyone has noticed the snow has made walking difficult this week. It must be tricky for those carrying parcels late in the evening." Several villagers laughed softly, but one or two betrayed a twitch of unease. Miss Marple allowed the conversation to drift, then returned, bringing up names, incidents, and places with casual curiosity. Each response, no matter how trivial, was noted. Too quick a denial, averted eyes, a pause longer than polite conversation warranted. She did not press. She simply observed. A misstep, a contradiction, a revealing sigh. These were the threads she needed to follow. By the time the villagers had finished their tea, she had set a subtle trap, one that relied not on force or accusation, but on human nature itself. By evening, as the last cup was drained and the final crumbs removed, Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire. The pattern was emerging. Someone among these familiar faces had slipped, however slightly, and soon the truth would begin to unravel under the patient scrutiny of her mind. The vicarage room hummed with the soft clatter of teacups and low conversation, the glow of the fire casting gentle shadows along the walls. Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting idle in her lap, eyes alert and observant. She had a particular phrase in mind, one that, she suspected, might elicit a reaction if carefully introduced. As she sipped her tea, she commented aloud, "It is curious how, even in small villages, one sometimes finds that secrets, long thought safe, can reveal themselves on the quietest of evenings." At this, a slight flinch came from Mr. Hawthorne, a portly man with a ruddy complexion and a habit of clearing his throat unnecessarily. He shifted in his chair, brushing a hand over the back of it almost absent-mindedly, yet Miss Marple noticed the movement immediately. The gesture was instinctive, a small, telling slip that betrayed a sudden discomfort, a flinch from recognition. She continued gently, speaking of wax dripped in the wrong place, of letters crumpled and lost, of the dangers of hidden truths. All the while, Mr. Hawthorne's eyes darted just slightly to the floor, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of a napkin. Nothing overt, nothing accusatory, yet his body spoke a language Miss Marple understood perfectly. Other villagers remained at ease, chatting and laughing politely, unaware of the subtle tension. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled beneath her spectacles. The pattern was emerging clearly. Instinctive gestures, unguarded reactions, and unconscious movements often revealed more than words ever could. By the time tea was over, she was confident that the first threads of true culpability were beginning to show themselves, quietly, unmistakably, under the calm guise of a festive gathering. The vicarage had emptied, leaving only the soft flicker of firelight and the lingering scent of tea and Christmas cake. Outside, snow drifted silently against the windows, muffling the world beyond. Miss Marple remained by the hearth, knitting needles poised, her eyes bright with calm certainty. The evening's subtle examinations, the careful steering of conversation, and the small gestures she had observed all came together in her mind. The pattern was complete, a tapestry woven of wax stains, whispered threats, and instinctive flinches. She knew now, with the quiet authority that came from decades of observation, who had orchestrated the deaths and why. The police, confident in their theories of mad impulse or convenient suspects, would not see it. Constable Briggs, bless his heart, was already drafting reports, convinced of his insight. Yet Miss Marple, serene as ever, understood the truth with unerring clarity. She leaned back, knitting resting in her lap, and allowed herself a faint smile. The killer's careful mask, the outward calm, the polite conversation, all of it had betrayed them. Outside, the village slept, oblivious to the revelation quietly achieved in a warm corner of the vicarage. Miss Marple's sharp mind held the answer, while the world waited unknowingly on the cusp of revelation. Chapter 7. The Whisper Beneath the Bells. The vicarage sitting room glowed warmly against the frosted panes, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Miss Marple had invited the villagers for an evening of tea and conversation, though few suspected that the calm, cozy gathering would hold a resolution to the week's chilling events. One by one, familiar faces arrived, carrying expressions of polite curiosity, tinged with lingering anxiety. Mrs. Greenaway fussed over the tea service, while the vicar moved gently among the guests, offering soft reassurances and courteous smiles. Outside, snow muffled the world, leaving the room a quiet sanctuary from the cold and gossip. Miss Marple settled herself near the fire, her knitting resting neatly in her lap. Her eyes swept the room, taking in the villagers' attentive faces. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice calm and even. "I know these past days have been troubling, and yet, as with many things in village life, the most unsettling events often hide in plain sight." She paused, allowing her words to settle like the soft snow outside. "Tonight," she continued, "I would like to recount the sequence of happenings, the small, seemingly insignificant details that, taken together, reveal the truth. It is not always the obvious suspect, nor the loudest accusation, that holds the answer. Sometimes, it is the quiet observation of the overlooked that brings clarity." The villagers leaned forward, cups in hand, ears attuned to every word. A hush fell over the room, the soft bells from the distant church marking the passage of time. Miss Marple's gaze twinkled beneath her spectacles, serene yet purposeful. Miss Marple's voice was gentle yet precise as she began to recount the events. "You see," she said, fingers lightly resting on her knitting, "the tragedy did not occur by accident, nor by the impulsive hand of a madman. It was carefully orchestrated, relying on timing, distraction, and the clever manipulation of appearances." The villagers leaned in, eyes wide, as she continued. "First, the poison wine cup was placed with meticulous care. The moment chosen, during the carol service, when the congregation was singing and the candles flickered, ensured that no one would notice a hand lightly hovering over the tray. Attention was elsewhere. The murderer counted on the natural chaos of a festive gathering." She paused, allowing the imagery to sink in. Then came the letter, crumpled in the hymn book, designed to suggest urgency, yet anonymous enough to confuse any observer. It misdirected suspicion and created tension, as we saw with the young stable boy. Finally, the scattered clues, the wax, the missing glove, the whispered threats, were planted with care, crafting a trail that pointed to convenient suspects rather than the true culprit. Miss Marple's calm gaze swept across the room. Every act was calculated, every distraction purposeful. And yet, the smallest oversights, a wax drop in the wrong place, a furtive glance, a flinch at an innocent phrase, were enough for someone watching closely to see through the design. And I did. A hush settled over the room, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire. The villagers realized that the chaos they had witnessed was not random. It had been woven with precision, and now the pattern had finally become clear. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, calm yet unwavering, as she unfolded the tangled threads of motive before the attentive villagers. "We must consider not only what was done, but why," she said softly. "Often, the surface of village life, polite conversation, cheerful smiles, conceals far more than it reveals." She began with the inheritance. Mr. Weatherby's estate, though modest by some measures, was substantial enough to spark resentment. Disagreements over who would benefit and the timing of changes to his will created friction that festered quietly. In families, such disputes often simmer beneath decorum until desperation drives action. Her eyes then shifted subtly toward a few key faces. Next, consider the matter of the affair. Hearts and loyalties entwined in secrecy can breed envy and anger. A hidden relationship, discovered by the wrong person at the wrong time, can become a motive for drastic measures. And when combined with financial worry, it becomes potent indeed. Finally, she spoke of the blackmail. A letter whispered of threats, promises of silence purchased with fear. The victim was pressured to comply, and when he did not, the threat of exposure escalated. It is often this blend of desperation, fear, and anger that leads otherwise ordinary individuals to commit acts they never imagined possible. The villagers listened, rapt, as Miss Marple tied each element together. Inheritance disputes, romantic entanglements, and the need to silence a secret. Each alone might cause tension, but combined, they provided the impetus for the crimes we have observed. It is in the careful intersection of these pressures that the truth of human action is most clearly revealed. The room remained silent, the villagers absorbing the weight of what had been hidden in plain sight. The room was quiet, the fire casting a soft glow over the gathered villagers. Miss Marple's knitting rested in her lap as she spoke calmly, her voice steady and sure. "And so," she said, "all these seemingly disconnected events, the wax, the note, the glove, the second death, have been pieces of a single design, a pattern that could only have been laid by someone who understood how appearances deceive." Eyes shifted nervously across the room, breath held. Then Miss Marple's gaze settled on one figure, calm yet faltering beneath her steady observation. "You see, dear friends," she continued, "the truth is rarely hidden from those who know how to observe carefully. And sometimes, the weight of one's own conscience makes secrecy impossible." The figure in question turned pale, hands trembling. A quivering breath escaped as the gloved hands betrayed the tension within. Finally, in a voice cracked with emotion, the culprit spoke. "Yes, it is true. I did it. I wanted the inheritance, the secrets. I didn't mean to. It all went wrong." Gasps filled the room. Villagers drew back, some clutching their teacups, others pressing hands to their mouths. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, knitting needles poised, as she observed the long-avoided confession unfold before her. Proof that patience, careful observation, and understanding of human nature had revealed the truth. Chapter 8. Snowfall After the Storm. The morning after the confession, Willowbrook awoke to a crisp, silvery light that made the freshly fallen snow glisten like powdered sugar. The village felt quieter than usual, as if the landscape itself held its breath, reflecting the mixture of emotions that hung in the air. Constable Briggs arrived promptly to take the culprit away, his steps brisk on the icy lane. The villagers watched from doorways and windows, their expressions a complex blend of relief, curiosity, and lingering sorrow. Even those who had harbored suspicion felt the weight of reality settle upon them. Justice had been done, yet the emotional echoes of the week's tragedies were far from gone. Miss Marple, wrapped in her gray shawl, observed the scene calmly. Her eyes lingered on the departing figure, noting the small slump of the shoulders, the resignation in the gait. It was a quiet kind of justice, achieved not with loud accusation, but with patient observation and a deep understanding of human nature. Whispers of the events circulated softly among the villagers, from the post office to the bakery, as they returned to the rhythms of daily life. There were nods of recognition for Miss Marple, though she said little, allowing her work and insight to speak for themselves. Yet, despite relief, there remained a subtle sadness, the loss of life, the disruption of the village's harmony, and the realization that secrets, even in the most picturesque settings, could wield devastating consequences. And as the first soft flakes of snow began to fall again, Willowbrook seemed poised to heal, if cautiously, from its winter shadow. Later that evening, the vicarage sat bathed in the golden glow of lamplight, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Outside, snow continued to fall in gentle swirls, settling on the rooftops and hedges with delicate precision. The villagers had returned to their homes, leaving a hush over Willowbrook that felt almost reverent. Miss Marple sat quietly in her favorite armchair, knitting forgotten in her lap, her eyes tracing the flicker of the flames. She thought of the week's events, 2 deaths, a web of deceit, whispered threats, and the revelation of a carefully concealed motive. The puzzle had been solved, justice delivered, yet the human frailties that led to it lingered vividly in her mind. She considered how fear, desire, and desperation could drive otherwise ordinary people to extraordinary acts. How a polite smile might hide anger, how a casual remark could mask a calculated intention. Even at Christmas, a season meant for goodwill, the masks people wore could be as carefully crafted as any social ritual. Her thoughts were neither bitter nor judgmental. Instead, they were tempered with understanding, the quiet wisdom of a life spent observing the subtle truths of human nature. Miss Marple's gaze softened as she mused. We are all fallible, dear, and yet in our fallibility lies the capacity for kindness as well as error. The firelight danced on her spectacles, reflecting a serenity earned through patience, observation, and an enduring compassion for the intricate hearts of those around her. Christmas morning dawned bright and clear over Willowbrook, the snow sparkling like diamonds under the pale winter sun. Church bells rang across the village, their cheerful peals carrying over rooftops and glistening hedgerows, announcing the day with a sense of renewal. The chill in the air was sharp but invigorating, and villagers wrapped in thick scarves and woolen coats hurried along the snow-dusted lanes, cheeks rosy with excitement and anticipation. Families gathered in their homes, laughter blending with the smell of roasting meats and freshly baked pies. Children peered eagerly at packages tucked beneath modestly decorated trees, while parents and grandparents exchanged warm smiles, content to see familiar faces bright with joy. The earlier shadow of fear had lifted, replaced by a cautious but genuine sense of relief. In the village square, the church service began anew, carols flowing through the frosty air. Miss Marple walked slowly among the congregation, appreciating the familiar rhythm of voices raised in harmony. She noted the subtle shifts in posture, the glances of reassurance exchanged among neighbors, and the small gestures of kindness that marked a community united in recovery. Even the snow seemed to reflect the restored peace, soft, undisturbed, and pure. Willowbrook, though scarred by recent events, embraced the season once more, its gentle charm resilient. Amid the laughter, music, and crisp winter light, life resumed, delicate yet enduring, a testament to the village's quiet strength and the subtle wisdom of those, like Miss Marple, who see beyond appearances to the truth beneath. The evening settled softly over Willowbrook, a quiet hush descending over snow-covered rooftops. Inside her snug sitting room, Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea, the steam curling gently toward the ceiling. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light across the familiar furniture, the ticking of the clock marking time with comforting regularity. She sat back in her favorite armchair, cup in hand, eyes drifting to the dancing flames. Thoughts of the past day's events lingered. The deaths, the subtle clues, the whispers and glances, all threads of human nature revealed under careful observation. Yet, despite the sorrow, there was peace in knowing that truth had triumphed and that justice, quiet and patient, had been served. Lowering her voice to a soft murmur, as if speaking to the fire itself, she whispered, "There is no darkness so deep that human nature does not reveal itself, if one only watches closely enough." Outside, the snow glistened under the moonlight, peaceful once more. Inside, the warmth and quiet of home embraced her, and the knowledge that life, with its complexities and secrets, would continue, gentle, resilient, and ever watchful. Miss Marple sipped her tea, serene, and the village settled into a calm Christmas night, ready to awaken to a brighter, quieter morning. The fire in Miss Marple's sitting room burned low, casting a gentle, golden glow over the familiar surroundings. Outside, Willowbrook lay quiet beneath a fresh blanket of snow, rooftops sparkling in the pale light of a winter moon. The chaos of the past days had softened into memory, the village returning to its gentle rhythms. Miss Marple, wrapped in her warm shawl, poured herself a final cup of tea. The aroma of bergamot mingled with the lingering scent of pine from the modest Christmas decorations. She sat quietly, reflecting on the delicate balance between joy and sorrow, how even at a time of festivity, human nature could reveal both kindness and folly. Every glance, every whispered word, every carefully hidden secret had led her to the truth. Yet now, peace prevailed, tempered with the understanding that life's complexities were never fully resolved, only navigated with care. With a small smile, she took a slow sip of tea, feeling the warmth spread through her. In every village, in every home, the narrator continued, there are stories hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered by those who watch closely, who listen carefully, who understand the human heart. And now, dear listener, it is your turn. Did you suspect the culprit before Miss Marple revealed the truth? Share your thoughts in the comments, and continue to explore the charming, suspenseful world of St. Mary Mead, Willowbrook, or Rosehill alongside our ever-curious detective. The snow outside drifted softly, the village at rest. Inside, the fire crackled, the tea grew cooler, and Miss Marple's eyes twinkled knowingly. Another mystery had concluded, another story told, leaving warmth, reflection, and the promise of yet more secrets to uncover in the days to come.